Before we begin this episode, we would like to say that in the spirit of reconciliation, that we acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to the land, sea and community. We pay our respects to the elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. Welcome back to another episode of Spaghettification. I'm the artist formerly known as the Drunk Astronomer and now known as Astropunk.
And I'm Esther Steffi. Today we have with us Professor Fred Watson.
Formerly known as Astronomer at Learn.
Fred Watson is an English-born astronomer, popular scientist in Australia. Fred holds the role of Australia's first astronomer at large with the Commonwealth Government of Australia and relays important aspects of Australian astronomy to the government, the general public and associated organisations. In 1995, Fred became astronomer in charge of the Australian Astronomical Observatory, but he's best known for his work with science outreach. Fred has written many books as well as musical and choral works on top of his many nationwide radio slots with the ABC. Fred has also been a frequent guest on the project. In January 2010, Fred was made a member of the Order of Australia for service to astronomy, particularly the promotion and popularisation of space science through public outreach. That, however, is a small amount of what Fred has accomplished in his life, and he's with us today to share with us more on his life in the field of astronomy and his thoughts on where astronomy is going. Welcome to the podcast, Fred.
It is a great pleasure, Mark and Steffi. It's lovely to meet you and to be with you on screen. Mark and I have met before, of course, but that's
yes.
a different matter.
Yeah, you
talk about that.
You took the piss out of me on in front of lots of people, but that's all right. I'm okay.
So have I. So.
Well, there you go. Well, we're meeting in good company, Steffi.
It's a common theme. You grew up in Yorkshire, and now we find you as a staple of Australian science astronomy. How did you end up in Australia, and what brought you to Australia?
Astronomy. It's absolutely what brought me here. But there's a little bit more to the story than that. And you're quite right, I did grow up in Yorkshire on the edge of an industrial city. Fortunately, it was the nicer edge of the industrial city. Actually, that I always credit, where I grew up with my interest in astronomy, because in fact, I was born in a house and lived through my childhood in a house that had a view to die for, literally. Oh. It was in Cemetery Road. So, there's a lovely view over the cemetery, which was enchanting in its own way. But beyond that, there were open hills and valleys, which always interested me. And I always wanted to see a bit more of what was out there. And that's why I got fascinated with telescopes. I just, yearned to have binoculars and telescopes and things, even as a young kid. And that evolved into an interest in astronomy that took me to university, took me to my first proper job in astronomy, which was working for the company in the UK that actually built the telescope that I later became astronomer in charge of, the Anglo-Australian telescope at Siding Spring Observatory in New South Wales. So this was a company with the marvellous name of Sir Howard Grubb Parsons and Company Limited, which
Grubb Parsons.
Yeah, so they built the Grubb part of that built your Great Melbourne Telescope back in 18.
Certainly did, yes.
And interestingly, I worked for the company exactly 100 years later, but a lot of what they did was still the same as when they built the Great Melbourne Telescope back in the 1860s. And in fact, that sort of thing was a challenge, because my job, part of my job was actually working on an ultraviolet telescope that was being built for a spacecraft, which rejoiced in the name of TD1. And eventually it flew in 1972. But when you build optics for a space telescope, you're measuring things in grams, whereas when you build a Great Melbourne or any other telescope, you're measuring things in tons and tens of tons. And that transition was something that Grubb Parsons really didn't manage to make, which is very sad. So they're no longer in existence. Anyway, that was my first job. Then I went back to uni to do a master's in astronomy, worked on asteroid orbits. Then I worked on planetary orbits at the Royal Greenwich Observatory for 3.5 years. Then I went to the Royal Observatory in Edinburgh and worked on star orbits around the centre of our galaxy. You can see the trend here. It's all orbits getting. And that's what actually brought me to Australia, to get back to your question, Mark. Well, that's good, isn't it? It's a question mark.
We got there eventually.
The bottom line is that the Royal Observatory in Edinburgh, where I worked, which of course is in Scotland, in fact that's where I was educated as well, that had an outstation at that time called the United Kingdom Schmidt Telescope, which was at Siding Spring Observatory near Coonabarabran in northwestern New South Wales, and staff astronomers from the Royal Observatory Edinburgh basically were sent out there on 3-year tours of duty to work and live and become well-rounded astronomers. That took place 40 years ago, not actually last month. 40 years ago, October 1982 was when I came to live in Australia. And you can see, I've got such a strong Australian accent now after all that.
Absolutely.
Anyway, that's the story, the long and short of the story. I did go back to the UK after 10 years. But the reason why the reason why 3 years stretched into 40 was because the project I was working on turned out to be really important and was, snapped up by astronomers worldwide, as it still has been, the use of optical fibers in big telescopes. So that's what got me here, in a nutshell. At the end of it, then. We're done.
Yeah, we're finished now. No, yeah, when you're talking about Siding Springs, that's the first place I saw you live. It was the 2016 open day for the Astro Fest up there, Science in a Pub, and you were on the panel up the top. It was a pretty funny panel.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I was going to say, I haven't been to Siding Spring for 5 years, I think, and I miss it very much. It's a very special place up there. That's not a question, though. My question is, so you've been known to say that you spent so many years working on large telescope domes that you've started to look like one. Mark wrote that. I didn't write that.
In my research, I found a quote from Fred where he actually says that. Unless someone's just said that you said that quote.
But I'm really interested to hear your answer to this question, because I had a spirited conversation earlier today at ScienceWorks with some colleagues there about no one finds telescopes interesting. They find what we can see with telescopes interesting. But I want to know, what are the most interesting telescopes you've had the honor of using through your career, Fred?
Oh, gosh. Grubb Parsons, the company that I mentioned a few minutes ago, they, in the 60s, 70s and 80s, built 3 of what remain the finest 4-meter class telescopes in the world. The 3.9-meter Anglo-Australian telescope here in Australia, the 3.8-meter United Kingdom infrared telescope on Mauna Kea, Hawaii, and the 4.2-meter William Herschel telescope, which is on the island of La Palma in the Canary Islands. And I've actually used all of them for different things. The AAT, of course, as astronomer in charge, which I was from 1995 to about 2015. I used it in a lot of different modes for my research and servicing other people's research. The UCAT one was really interesting. So I used that for measuring the infrared magnitudes or brightnesses of a class of variable star that I used to work on called RL Lyrae variables, which are important variable brightness stars. This was a long time ago, and I was youthful and fit, but I still had the problem that many astronomers had observing on the summit of Mauna Kea, which is staying awake at night, because the altitude there, it's 14,000 feet or 4.2 kilometers above sea level, and that dearth of oxygen was enough to make it a very hard job, even though the data were riveting stuff. Okay. And of course, it's one of the finest sites for astronomy in the Northern Hemisphere. So that was interesting. And La Palma, I was actually an instrument scientist by then. I was building fiber optic instruments along with many other people, but I was project scientist for something called WIFOS, the Wide Field Fiber Optic Spectrograph on that William Herschel telescope. So a lot of what I did was commissioning instruments, and that's always a tough job, because you're trying to add some new gizmo device that you put on it, built for a telescope. You're adding it to the telescope to try and make these two entities work together. and often there are interesting disparities between them, especially when you're talking about the computer controls between the two. They often don't talk to one another. They sort of fold their arms and say nah. And so commissioning is always an arduous job. But nevertheless, I got through it and lived to tell the tale. So I guess those three telescopes are the ones that have imprinted themselves most on my mind, and are probably the biggest telescopes I've used. I have never ventured into the world of the 8-meter class telescopes.
It is a terrifying world. I have only been to Mauna Kea, the summit, once after a Keck observing trip, and that was when I was a master's student. And my supervisor was like, every second costs us like $10 or something. And I was just like, okay, we'll keep working.
No pressure, no pressure.
Yeah. And then of course 2 o'clock you fall asleep. But I was running around the summit like I was tipsy or something. And my supervisor was very worried because and one woman did faint while we were up there as well. So fortunately that happens pretty often, and they were just like, okay, yep, we'll get her up.
But what a great place to observe. Did you see sunsets and things of that sort, just to watch them?
Yeah, not from the summit, but I have this big memory of just like looking around and seeing Mauna Loa there, like just like stretching over the entire horizon. It's amazing. You sort of think like if you could be on Mars, and Olympus Mons would be even bigger somehow.
When you observe with the Keck, are you observing remotely? So they got a place in Waimea, haven't they?
Yeah. So we observed from Waimea, and then it was all remote from there. But then they're generally pretty happy to take you up to the summit, so long as you sort of tell them in advance. But so the first time I observed, even the support staff was still up on the summit. But I think a few years ago they brought them all down too. So now it's all basically completely remote, which is interesting.
That's right. In the early days of Mauna Kea, which is when I used to observe there, it was all done at the summit, and only a few people could actually routinely work up there, just because
I don't think I could.
just on the telescopes, this is like an added question, because you talk about the favorite ones you've worked on. Are there any that you've wanted to work on but haven't had the opportunity? Like, is there a dream telescope, Hubble and James Webb aside, I'd say, but is there any other telescope that's about at the moment or coming online soon that you would love to work on?
I've got two answers to that, actually, and one is the answer as given by the 2022 Fred Watson, and the other is the answer that would have been given by the 1962 Fred Watson, because there was a telescope that I found in a book, which
we're going book hunting. Oh, I like
it. King's History of the Telescope. This is the textbook until I wrote my history of the telescope. In this book, there are 2 engravings of the Great Melbourne Telescope. Honestly, I was captivated, and I'm talking about 60 years ago now. The idea of observing with that telescope filled me with excitement. Now, I didn't know that it had long gone and been moved to Mount Stromlo, and in fact it was sold for scrap. 1944 it was sold there. It was only later in life that I realized that a telescope which I knew at Mount Stromlo was the Great Melbourne in disguise. So after the fire in 2003 at Mount Stromlo, when that telescope was effectively wiped out, I thought that's the end of the story. I'll never observe with this telescope, but I still have aspirations to work with it, because I've been quite closely involved, I'm very honoured to say, in fact I think I'm its patron, with the project to restore the Great Melbourne Telescope, and look forward to one day clapping my eye to the eyepiece as the 17-year-old Fred Watson wanted to do. Remembering what happened to it in 2003. Amazing the progress that's been made. It's taken a long time. And so the other half of my answer is the 2022 Fred Watson. I very much observe with the ESO ELT, which is a 39.3 meter telescope that's being currently built on the summit of a mountain called Cerro Amazones in northern Chile. And that will be the biggest optical telescope in the world. Wouldn't that be a thrill to observe that?
Yeah.
I'm jealous now. I've only got access to a 40-inch telescope.
Yeah, it's not
It's
bad.
Do you,
one meter, not
Is that the HP?
39. So yeah. That's the one we've got at our dark sky site, and it's a cracking telescope to use. It's really good, but it's not 39 meters. That's for sure.
Do you have any insight into how construction of that is going, Fred? The ELT?
Yeah, so it's slower than expected, and a lot of that's due to the consequences of the pandemic.
Yeah.
Things like the fact that the engineers that were involved with it basically got laid off for the various contractors who were working with it.
Yeah.
But I know that the foundations on Serra Amazonis are in place. I might just put in a plug as well for
go for it.
an event. So that telescope will be operated by, in fact, it's originated and operated by the European Southern Observatory, with which we in Australia have a strategic partnership. So we're partner countries for Europe. And at the end of this month, actually, there is a very senior delegation coming from the European Southern Observatory, including its Director General, Professor Xavier Barcon. And they're going to do talks and things around Australia. Sadly, they're not coming to Melbourne, but we'll get them on air to broadcast on the ABC and things like that. And we hope that we'll hear a lot more about how things are going with the ELT. It's a marvel. I first emerged actually around about the year 2000, a little bit before, with the idea of building the world's biggest optical telescope ever. With a mirror that was going to be 100 meters in diameter, and that was going to be called OWL because OWL was
overwhelmingly
large. That's right. Until they realised it had an overwhelmingly large price tag as well. And so it came down to 39.3 meters. But it'll still be a marvelous facility when it gets going. And knowing what ESO is like, they are superb at building instruments that that really wipe the floor with anything else, and so it will be marvelous to see what comes from it. But my chances of actually using the ELT are formally zero. They're zilch.
Well, it's 1,000% more than my chances. So.
Well, not sure about that actually. You've probably got longer than me, Mark. You never know.
No, I'm not in the right field. Not me. Changing topic a bit. Astronomer at large. How does one become the astronomer at large, and what are the benefits to science and astronomy to have someone like you in that role?
You're kind of asking me to blow my own trumpet there.
I absolutely am. Yes.
Perfectly happy to do. I usually play the guitar, but trumpet I can manage. So it emerged because, well, all right, let's set the scene. For 20 years, I was the astronomer in charge of the National Observatory. And in that role, which was actually a kind of management and science role, I did a lot of science. I was project manager for various surveys and things of that sort. But I also found myself talking a lot to the media, because the media liked the idea of an astronomer in charge, sort of. Anyway, for whatever reason. So that became a big part of my job. And in 2018, and this is part and parcel of the deal that secured Australia's strategic partnership with ESO, the European Southern Observatory. In 2018, the domestic observatory at Siding Spring, what was the Australian Astronomical Observatory, stopped being the Australian Astronomical Observatory and basically was taken over by the university sector. So a consortium of 11 universities, which does include Swinburne, are responsible for funding and operating that telescope. The actual operations are run by the ANU. So the former staff, who were government employees, basically were transferred over to the university sector, with one exception, and that was me, because I said I don't want to be stealing other people's jobs who are far more valuable than I am. I would like to stay with the government sector, if I may, because I think I still have a role in astronomy outreach, in advocacy, and perhaps in feeding astronomy type information to the government, which is you know, actually what the job description is. And so they like that idea. And so I'm still in that role 4 years later. So it was actually my then Uber boss, whose name was, well, still is, Jane Urquhart. She suggested, you know, they looked around for a new title. And government astronomer had already been taken because the old state observatories had a government astronomer. So, so they recognised that having been astronomer in charge, if they made me astronomer at large, you'd only need to change 4 letters on the office door to the other. It didn't seem to occur to any of us that it was actually a different office, but that's all right. But it was the then Minister for Science who loved the idea, Karen Andrews, Minister Andrews. She kind of dubbed me the astronomer at large. We had a really nice little ceremony, a tiny ceremony, and that was how the thing came about. But as I said, so that the main roles are getting astronomy into people's minds, whether they're school kids or whether they're, you know, just ordinary members of the public, whether they're politicians, talk to anybody about it and try and make sure it's at a level that people can get hold of and get some of the excitement that we feel as astronomers. And you know, we all of us live our lives in a state of total excitement of what's going on, and to try and get some of that over into the public purview is part of it. But the other half is, as I've said, it's so the Department of Industry, Science and Resources, which is the department within which I work, consists of 2,000 government grown-ups and 1 astronomer. So the government grown-ups don't actually know anything about astronomy, but I do. So I can feed into some of the decision-making processes that go on within the government, and try and, you know, represent the views of the nation's astronomers as well.
What sort of advocacy does your role need? You know, is it more like funding?
Perhaps I can, you know, quote an example in that, and it relates to ESO, to the European Southern Observatory. I perhaps should mention that the little group within which I work has responsibilities for many of the major facilities that astronomers use, the upcoming ones, most notably the Square Kilometre Array, which will be the world's biggest radio telescope when it's built in Southern Africa and in Western Australia. Also, we have, and this came partly through Swinburne actually, but also through the ANU, we have a vested interest in something called the Giant Magellan Telescope, which is another of these ELTs with a rather special set of 7 mirrors which constitute something 23 meters in diameter. An amazing piece of equipment. That's also being built in northern Chile. And again, the foundations of that are well in place. I saw that a few years ago. But the other one, as well as the Anglo-Australian telescope, which we still own as a government at Siding Spring, the other one is the ESO, the European Southern Observatory Strategic Partnership. Now, that was signed off on in 2017, and it's 10 years. So it means we're actually now halfway through this deal. And, you know, the question is what comes after it? And from ESO's perspective, what comes after it is Australia applying for full membership of the European Southern Observatory, which we are allowed to do.
Is this kind of like Eurovision? They just let Australia win.
Infinitely more glamorous than
Even though we're not European.
Even though we're not European.
We don't stay up quite as late as the Eurovision fans.
Right, yeah. So you know, yes, it's right. But if we had full membership, then we would have, as of right, access to things like the ELT, this extremely large telescope, which at the moment we don't, mainly because it's not built yet. But even if it was, we still wouldn't have access to it.
Yes.
So that is the aspiration of all of Australia's astronomers, and it's actually locked in their decadal plan. It's very well organised. Australian astronomy has a decadal plan. Every 10 years they rewrite that, but it's been uppermost on the last 2 decadal plans for full membership of ESO. The only thing is that's rather expensive. It costs a lot of money to do that, and so the advocacy comes about in trying to get the message out to not only decision makers, but the general public who might influence the decision makers. So it's a question of advocating for example, Australia's full membership of ESO. And that's a thing very close to my heart, because I think it's very important that we do. I actually fear for Australia's optical astronomy effort if we don't get full membership of ESO. If for some reason the funding simply wasn't available for that, that would, as one of my colleagues said, it would put Australian optical astronomy back 50 years to the time before the Anglo-Australian telescope.
Do you see, so the AAO no longer exists, the Australian Astronomical Observatory, because the funding for that went into the ESO deal. This is all technical stuff for people who are not astronomers. I apologize, dear listeners, but
no, but they want to know this stuff. Our listeners,
I want to know. That's why I'm picking Fred's brain. So if we no longer had an ESO deal after 2022, do you see that money just disappearing, or would we look to rebuild something here in Australia?
It's not even that, Steffi. The money is not there. So what happened back in 2017 is there was an approval from Treasury to put it. Actually, $129 million was the sum, and what that does is gives us 10 years of this strategic partnership. But in 2017, that simply disappears. It simply vanishes. So for anything that might follow that, you've got to put in a new bid. And that's in fact what we're working on within the department. And it's one reason why we're so anxious that this visit by all the ESO top brass at the end of this month would go so well, because we want to showcase what potential there is in full membership of ESO. And my feeling is it'll go swimmingly. I hope it does. I'm deeply involved in it. I don't want to leave hanging my head in shame. But I think it's a time to be excited about the possibilities that in 5 years' time we might be putting our hands up as shiny brand new members of the European.
That would be very exciting.
That's right. Industry, by which I mean the facilities within Australia that can build optical instruments and can build bits and pieces of telescopes and things like that. That's one of the reasons why we think this membership deal will be so good, because it would actually stimulate Australian industry and give them a vehicle to put Australian products onto telescopes overseas and things.
Well, speaking of developing instruments, can you tell us about your involvement in the use of fiber optics in astronomy during the 1980s and what the benefits of using fiber optics in astronomy are?
Well,
back around.
How's that for a segue?
I love the opportunity to talk about this stuff because it, again, is something very close to my heart. So it goes back to 1979, in fact, when I wasn't involved at that time. I was working at the Royal Observatory in Edinburgh on the idea of measuring the velocities of many, many stars. These are RLI variables I mentioned earlier around the center of our galaxy. Now, you know, Steffi, and you know, Mark, too, but some of your listeners might not know that you can measure the speed of a star towards or away from you by looking at its spectrum.
I just like the fact that you're assuming that I know. I'm
Maybe he was being polite, Mark.
In this podcast as the 5-year-old astronomer, so you have to talk to me as if I don't know anything. So
that's what I'm about to do.
The assumption that I know is good. It makes me feel smart.
Yeah. So you know, we can split the light of a star or any other object up into a rainbow of colors, which magically we find is crossed by this kind of barcode of information, which reveals all the intimate details of the star or galaxy or whatever it is. But one of those details is the speed along the line of sight, what we call in technical terms the radial velocity. And so that velocity is what I was after when I was working back in the late 1970s on these particular stars. And in fact, was it 78 was my first visit here to Australia to use the Anglo-Australian telescope to measure some of these star radial velocities. These are stars clustering around the center of our galaxy. So I was interested in finding out how they moved. And back in those days, if you wanted to measure the spectrum of a star and hence its velocity, you basically had to do it one star at a time. And that was what I did. So came in 1978. Actually, I didn't measure any stars in 1978 because my entire run on the telescope was wiped out by bad weather, as it was the following year and the year after. It was a disaster.
78 wasn't the bad weather. It was the year I was born, and I must have caused some kind of massive magnetic storm or something.
Could have been that. Could have been that. I did notice something funny going on, actually, while I was there that year, I have to say.
It had to have been the impact of me being born and everybody freaking out.
What really freaked them out was all the rain. They called me Fred the Farmer's Friend, because every time I came, you had to do it one at a time. And I think my first successful observing run, which wasn't until 1980, I think we got 20 stars or something. And I wanted hundreds. And that's where this trick of using optical fibers helps you. And it was actually thought of by an English-born American astronomer by the name of Roger Angel in Arizona. The idea of using optical fibers, which look a bit like guitar strings, but they have this property that if you put light in at one end, it comes out almost uninhibited at the other end. And so the idea is to get lots of these fibers and line them up with your target stars and then bring them all back to a device we call a spectrograph, which turns that light into a rainbow and gives you the spectrum lines that you're looking for, these barcode information, and hence the velocity. And so that was pioneered actually at Arizona, but it was turned into an industry here in Australia by a colleague of mine at the Anglo-Australian Telescope. I was then working at the UK Schmidt Telescope. My colleague at the Anglo-Australian Telescope, a young engineer by the name of Peter Gray, later went on to great things in actually various observatories, including ESO and Keck, I think, too. Peter and I basically took this idea and turned it into something that you could use for real on telescopes. And so I built the first wide field multi-fiber spectrograph. So what we did was lined up fibers in the focus of the UK Schmidt telescope, which had a field of view, an angle of view of 6.5 degrees, very wide angle. That way we could measure the speed of, well, for me, it was 40 stars at a time, but eventually it became thousands, as we are now doing with some of the equipment that's being built today. So that was the start of all that. And I feel both humbled and proud to have been in right at the beginning and built some of the, the world's first equipment of this type, because it now has become a big industry. And it's what kept me. It's why my 3-year tour of duty turned first of all into 10 years and eventually into permanent.
Must have been pretty impressive to go from like no stars to 20 and going, I want more, to all of a sudden to 40 a day. Was it 40 a day? Is that what you're saying?
It was, yes.
Yeah, and then to thousands.
A night usually, but that's right. So thousands is what they do today. The workhorse instrument on the Anglo-Australian Telescope is something called 2DF, which stands for 2-degree field. I always thought it was a rubbish name because I gave much the instruments I built. My first one on the Schmidt was the fiber-linked array imagery formatter, which is FLAIR, FLNR. And then I upgraded it to be a wider field instrument, and that was Panache, which was panoramic area coverage with high efficiency.
I like that one.
FLAIR, Panache. We should make the Mark III version Finesse. Eventually, we built the robotic version, which was 60F, the 60 field system.
Yeah,
that did many great surveys of both galaxies and stars.
My first observing run was at the AAT using 2DF with SkyMapper team.
Okay.
So this was a long time ago when SkyMapper was still vibrating everywhere. But then also, I'm at the planetarium in Melbourne, and we have a show. My favorite show is the one where we basically go from the surface of the Earth all the way out to the cosmic microwave background. And as part of that, we get to talk about galaxies. And I did do galaxies for my PhD, so I'm always excited to talk about that. And we talk about some of the early galaxy surveys, which, as you were saying, sort of you could do one galaxy at a time. So maybe you get 12 galaxies a night, and it takes a long time to get thousands of them. And then suddenly you got the 2DF galaxy retro survey and 60F, and you can do, so 2DF does 400 objects at a time, and you've just increased your efficiency so much, and you see like all the points come up for the 2DF galaxy survey, and it's just amazing seeing like how much further you could suddenly see with this amazing instrument.
Explain to your listeners what a redshift gives you. So for a galaxy, if you do this velocity trick, what it's actually telling you is the distance of the galaxy. So it
Yeah.
means you can plot these galaxies in three-dimensional space, which is just an incredible thing to do. And the 2DF survey was one of the first big ones, really big ones. I think it was Swinburne that did a marvelous fly-through of the
the Swinburne astronomy productions. I still use that video. You get basically the same thing that I've been talking about, but it also includes the Sloan data. So Sloan was a telescope that was basically devoted to using fiber. I think Fred can correct me, using fiber optics to get galaxies just every night for years and years and years, and got millions of galaxies. So anyway, is it my question now?
No, you asked your question.
No, I asked my question. I want to talk about fiber optics.
No, we can't do that. We're going to move on to the next question, because the next question is all about me.
Before we leave fiber optics, let me just add one question.
Yes,
that is, with a fiber, what you're doing is you're constraining light in a tiny glass sliver, a tenth of a millimeter in diameter. I used to hold them in my hand when the telescope was tracking galaxies and think there's ancient light pulsating through my fingers here. It's quite a romantic thing to do in the middle of the night when you're on your own. It's what happens. But what I was going to say was this whole area has now advanced in a way that I didn't foresee back in the early 1980s into what we call astrophotonics, where you're using really sophisticated waveguide devices well, one of the things you can do is within the fiber, you can filter out the sort of light that you don't want that comes from the night sky itself. You can actually filter that out in the fiber. And there are other really clever things that you can do. Here in Sydney, we've got scientists both at Macquarie University and Sydney University who are working on this stuff. And it is just brilliant. It really excites me as to what we might be able to do in the future with this kind of thing.
One thing I wanted to ask you, Fred, while we have you. So when I'm doing spectroscopy of galaxies, one thing I want is if you have a slit and you take a spectrum, you get a little bit of the spatial sort of distribution of light in the galaxy. Do you get that with fiber optics as well, or does the light get sort of a bit mixed up as it's coming through?
Yeah, the only way you can do it is by exactly what you've talked about, the SOMI, where you've got a bundle of, basically you collect light from the whole galaxy, and then you can analyze it cleverly. But you're quite right, with a slit, you do get the of the galaxy almost, or the rotation of the galaxy. Sometimes get just by looking at what's Anyway, Mark, it's all about you.
Anyway, Mark,
it's about me, all right? Come on, back to me. As a fellow advocate for public outreach in astronomy, and I'm a big advocate for it, what tips can you give me in how I approach my love of sharing astronomy with the public? And can you tell me what it is about outreach that drives you to continue to do it? And what I mean by that is, I've held a theory for a long time that the sky belongs to everyone, and that those who can't afford telescopes to look at the sky or the opportunity to learn to look at the sky have as much right to share the night sky as the rest of us do.
Very similar to the philosophy that kind of gripped me when I was a young astronomer, like you are. In those days, near the start of my career, I was working for an organisation, it's part of the Royal Greenwich Observatory, but it was called Her Majesty's Nautical Almanac Office, and it was Her Majesty in those days. So it was where what we call planetary ephemerides were worked out, where planets are going to be, where asteroids are going to be, where the moon's going to be, all of this stuff, the nitty-gritty of how the solar system works was what we did at the Nautical Almanac Office. But we got a lot of queries from the public, and I always felt that since I was being paid from the public purse to do stuff that I thought was really fun, that it was important that I actually fed some of this back to the public. So I was always keen to help where I could. And once you've demonstrated that you're happy to pick up a phone and have a conversation with somebody, then that's kind of what you do, because there are so many, or there were certainly in those days, there were so many astronomers who just wanted to lock themselves up in their ivory towers and forget about the outside world.
They still do. There
are some who are like that. I think it's changed an awful lot though, Mark.
Oh, it has.
Got some fabulous astronomy communicators in the country now who've got the same passion. We're fortunate to be able to do this, so we try and get it out there. So that was what started it. But I mean, the biggest tip that I can give anybody, and it's not really a tip, it's kind of a basic condition of science outreach, if you don't like people, you might as well forget it. You've kind of got to like people, and then that's the first step. If you like people, the rest is pretty easy. There was a conference that I was at recently, and I said that, and these were all science communicators. So if you don't like people, put your hand up. And somebody did. So I said, come and see me afterwards. I think people, in your case, Steffi, I think the public generally really respects somebody who's actually working in the field professionally, if I can put it that way. Between professionals
Absolutely.
because I'm still an amateur as well. But if you're getting paid for doing that, then that gives you maybe a bit of ground
cachet.
that the public respects, and they love hearing. And especially when it's somebody really personable like you are, they love that combination.
They do.
Somebody with an easy smile.
I would agree with that. In that some of the most popular science communicators, from a social media point of view in particular, are the ones that are fun, exciting, and engaging. That's the other one I've always had, is you need to make, or people, doesn't matter who it is, needs to, whether you're professional or amateur, you have to make it interesting and fun and enjoyable. If it becomes almost like a uni lecture, the general public they'll just glaze over and walk away.
Exactly.
Because it's not exciting, it's not fun.
And the key thing to avoid in that circumstance is using jargon. And it's so easy if you're working professionally. It's very easy just to drop into, stellar atmospheres and hyperfine structure and all this sort of thing that just completely goes over the head of your audience. And once that happens, you've lost them. You've really lost them. So jargon's a no-no for me, which is just as well, because I don't know what half these words mean now anyway.
At the Astro Talk on Sunday at the dinner, the one thing that the attendees told me at the end of it was how excited you guys were, yourself, Sarah, and Paul were. Every time a question was asked, it was like, who wants the mic first? You were fighting over it. We had Paul Lasky talking as well, and Sarah Webb would be like, I've got something to say. And she was literally throwing her hand up to make sure that the next question didn't come on, so she could put her 2 cents in worth on the topic. Yeah. And just, that was one thing that the attendees said to me, was just the excitement in the faces and the voices of the scientists talking to them was just engaging. Even if they didn't quite understand what was being spoken about, they could get the passion clearly.
I think that's really important. And, it's something I've heard people say a lot too. It's that half the fun is watching the astronomers getting excited about it, rather than the stuff itself, which is that's fine, whatever it takes.
Yeah, I guess on a little bit of a tangent. So you're a bit of an author, Fred. Can you tell us a bit more about what it's like to be an author and how you got into it?
So I suppose it's a bit old-fashioned these days, but my childhood was spent actually soaking up books just like this one that I've already shown.
You need to show us your ones as well.
No, they're all up. So anyway, I read a lot, and curiously, I was not that gifted in reading literature, but non-fiction literature grabbed me in a way, and this room's full of mostly non-fiction books, and so I guess it was natural to want to write. And that goes back a long time. And as with all these things, you start by writing articles. And I got invited to write articles for various magazines and journals and things of that sort, which was exciting and great. But it took me until 1995 to write my first book. But it was something that I was a bit passionate about. And it might surprise you to know what it was. It's quite a thin book. In fact, I will show you it because the title's on the front. It's about the history. It was the first book in English about the history of binoculars. It's a very, very slender book, but still exists. It's not in print anymore. And that's because I always loved binoculars, the idea of being able to look with both eyes at seeing something distant. I mentioned it right at the beginning, those hills that were just out of reach of the naked eye where I grew up. I never had binoculars really when I was a kid, but anyway, it was later on. And so I was always fascinated with them. And somebody gave me a pair of binoculars that I really couldn't identify. I didn't know whether they were new or old or what they were. And so I started looking for books on early binoculars, and I couldn't find any. So I found a few articles in obscure journals, and it turned out there was one book that had been written by a German author, so it was in German. And I thought, well, I've got to fix this. So I wrote my own, which appeared, as I said, in 1995. And so that's a little potted history of binoculars. And then it went on. The next one was about the history of telescopes, Stargazer, the life and times of the telescope. The next one was because by then I'd regular radio shows, and many of these had talkback features, so people phoned in with their questions, and I used to make a note. In fact, I still do make a note of what questions I was being asked. And so we did a book of questions that I'd been asked on the radio, and they chose one of them as the title. You never get to choose your own book title. It's always somebody else who does it for you. So they picked "Why is Uranus Upside Down?" and that's the title of the book, which I thought there were nicer questions in the book, but that's actually that's always been the bestseller of the books I've written.
I can tell why. It's the name.
Yeah. And then a few others came. The one after that was actually about it mixed, because my wife Marnie, her background's in travel, and we used to take, before COVID, people on tours all over the world to see where science happens, to see telescopes, to see laboratories, to see just places of history, medieval, observatories, even archaeoastronomy. Our first tour was actually to Peru to look at some amazing artifacts in northern Peru, at Chanquillo. Anyway, so the next one was a book of travels, but again it was Marnie who thought of the title of that, Star Craving Mad, which I always thought was very clever indeed. I can't think of stuff like that. And then there's been a couple more since. The latest is I might as well plug it. The latest is Space Warp, which is a book for the 10 to 110 year age group. People tell me it's a kid's book for adults on astronomy, and it actually was written for me when I was 12. So that's how I did it. When they said, "Will you write a kid's book?" I thought, "How on earth do you write a kid's book?" And I just basically put myself to when I was that sort of age and wrote it for me. And that's probably why it hasn't sold very well, because there's actually I don't know how it's done. I think it's doing okay. Space Warp, buy it for the family.
Question on the future now. Where do you see astronomy going, be it land-based or space-based, and what does the future of astronomy look like to you?
I have to say it looks pretty bright to me, notwithstanding the travails of brought along by geopolitics and climate change and all the things that we know the Earth is facing, or the world is facing, that are not easy to contemplate. Astronomy is very resilient. In fact, at the start of the pandemic, I did a talk. We have a talk series called Fred Watson Presents, and we turned them into pandemic webinars, Cosmic Relief we call them. So one of my talks was about astronomy in times of crisis, and it survives. And indeed our experience, and I'm sure both of you can relate to this, our experience in the pandemic is that people have got more interested in astronomy, and hobby shop telescopes sales are booming, hobby telescope shop sales are booming, and people are, I think astronomical societies are doing well. I think people have got a real interest, and it means for science communicators like the three of us here, you've got such an opportunity to be able to promote astronomy. So
just on that one, Fred, when you talk about COVID and the impacts on astronomy, you're spot on in that it increased, because the ASV, for instance, had 1,400 members when lockdown hit. And then I convinced the guys to let us do live streams, and we would live stack every 2 weeks. At some points it was every week, and we would come up with different names. We had close encounters, and we had Gazing at the Galaxies Volume 1, Guardians of the Galaxies. Also, so we had, Hitchhiker's Guide to Astronomy, and all these different things. And by the time lockdown had finished at the end of last year, the society had increased its membership by almost 400.
It's incredible.
In lockdown, and we had no in-person public viewing nights, no in-person meetings. It was all just online, live streamed. And we had thousands of people watching every week we did it, and people looked forward to it. And we get such amazing comments like, this is helping us so much through lockdown. That's probably what really got me into public outreach big time, was the fact that just seeing those responses. But you're right, it thrived in lockdown, absolutely thrived.
Yeah, so, in a way, that's a metaphor for the bigger picture that astronomy, because it's driven by curiosity, really. That's not actually why governments put funding into astronomy, but it's one of the reasons, because people are curious. But it's things like astronomy pushing technology to its limits. That's another of the reasons. It inspires youngsters. It's a great way of getting kids into science, all of that. It actually builds really strong international relationships as well. So it's a science that it's the gift that keeps on giving. And that's why I'm optimistic that, we will see, the JWST is going to be producing good stuff for 20 years, we hope, unless there's a big micrometeorite ding on the mirror, meteoroid. So there's a lot to look forward to, and with these big, these big ground-based facilities that are coming on stream, the square kilometre array, there is a celebration, and I don't think this is classified. I'm not sure when this podcast will go to air, but
probably next week.
In that case, it's perfectly safe for me to say this.
There is till at least Monday. So.
Yeah, on Saturday, which is 2 days from when we're recording this, there will be a ceremony at the Murchison Radio Astronomy Observatory, which is in Western Australia. And this celebrates the something called the ILUA, and the ILUA is the Indigenous Land Use Agreement. What it is a sort of contract between the First Nations people whose land that telescope is built on. They're the Wadjuri Yamaji people, and of the Murchison region. And that's, the science and everything is fine, but you need that First Nations basis on which to build this work. And so that it's been a long time coming, but that agreement will be signed on Saturday, and it's a big step forward in the square kilometre arrays, journey to reality, which is starting now. And just to give people an idea what this telescope is, the Australian component of it is the low frequency component. Australian radio astronomers are great at low frequency astronomy, and it consists of not dishes, actually. We all think of radio telescopes as dishes, but these are
antennas, isn't it?
Yeah, they're antennas. They look exactly like big Christmas trees made out of metal. And there are 132,000 of them, and that makes this telescope. They're joined electronically, and so you can steer the telescope electronically. It's a marvelous system. The other half of it in South Africa actually does have dishes. So that's going to tell us the most extraordinary things about, the early universe, the universe in the millennia after the Big Bang, when nothing was shining, what we call the Dark Ages. Only the remnants of the Big Bang were shining, but there were no stars. And so the idea is to probe that region, because you can measure and map where the cold hydrogen was at that early era in the universe, remembering, as we all do in science communication, that the further you look out into space, the further back in time you're looking, because of the finite speed of light and radio waves. And so we look far enough in space, we see right back to almost the beginning of the universe. And the SKA will be a great facility for that, as well as more nearby stuff, like looking at the molecular makeup of clouds of dust in the in the region where stars are being formed and things of that sort. So the one little factoid that I love is that the square kilometre array will be capable of picking up an airport radar at 50 light years. So that means, if there's some alien dude somewhere who turns on an airport radar within the beam of the square kilometre array, it could be detected.
Talking about pushing the boundaries of technology in astronomy, that's exactly what I do. Like I was saying to you earlier, that for me, it's all about getting people into astronomy in any way you can. And not everyone can afford all of that fancy equipment. And so I'll share an image. I want you to have a look at it. Is it going to come up? There it is. There it is. So you know what that is?
I do.
Yeah.
I remember that well.
Do you know that was taken using where is it? Here we go. An 80mm telescope and this.
And a smartphone, isn't that fabulous? Is that? Tell me what kind of phone that is.
That's a Google Pixel 5.
Okay, yeah. So state of the art. Well, it's astonishing. It is absolutely astonishing. That is so similar to the original David Malin image of the Orion Nebula, taken with the Anglo-Australian telescope in the 1970s. If I may make a comment, Mark, you had greasy finger marks on the lens glass. Because you can tell by looking at those star images.
I know. A big spike that's not meant to be there. Big
spike, it should be there, yeah. I've noticed the same thing,
absolutely know that was the case, but it was 1 a.m. on Saturday night, and I had a few beers.
It's fabulous. That is a fabulous image, and you are pushing technology and doing that. It's great.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, everybody's got a phone.
What sort of exposure was that? Just being technical for a minute.
That is 120 30-second exposure.
Right, okay.
90 30-second exposure. That's 45 minutes.
Yeah, so that was, you must have had the phone clipped onto the back end of the telescope.
Yeah, but it's only like a $30 phone adapter that you can get from
it's fantastic.
Big and that. Yeah. So that's
brilliant.
Pushing boundaries and showing people that you don't need a lot of money to get excited and interested in astronomy and push those boundaries and have a go.
That's fantastic. And I love the idea of, which we've done in the professional field as well. It's almost rigging things up in a makeshift fashion, because that's what works. Almost, the first fiber optic systems that I built were exactly like that. They were hung together with sticky tape and heaven knows what. And they did.
My tripod's a bit like that. I broke the middle bit, so I found some old aluminium offcuts and I cut and bolted together my own centerpiece to hold the tripod open so it didn't move too much. But everything I do is all about what's the most cost-effective way I can do it, because I don't have a lot of money to spend on telescope equipment.
Great stuff. Forgive me, but it's one of the reasons. Again, it comes down to why you fund astronomy. That camera that you've got in your phone there, the sensors in that started their life back in the 1980s on the business end of telescopes. It was driven by astronomy. So that's astronomy pushing technology and creating new ideas.
It's a big circle, isn't it? It's astronomy pushing. Yeah. We're up to our last question, Steffi, and then we've got the quiz.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a funny way to say this. So hopefully, get ready. You ready? Okay. So Fred, when you are not the astronomer at large, when you are the astronomer at small, what do you do?
The astronomer at home.
No, I'm not funny one, Mark. It's my turn. What do you like to do when you're not running around the country working and talking about astronomy and advocating and all those sorts of things?
It's hard to stop, actually. But, I see your question is a good one. And I guess the other great love in my life, apart from my family, of whom I'm incredibly proud, I have to say. I might put in a plug for one of them, who's an award-winning novelist.
I know which one.
Yeah, the other one's who's a flight attendant with Virgin. It's fabulous stuff. So that's they make me very happy and very proud. But the other thing is music, and it always has been. So you might not be able to see it, but I think I am the only astronomer in Australia professional astronomer in Australia who's won an APRA Music Award. It's actually on the wall there behind. That was actually a bit of a swizz, because it's not for the music that I won it. It was for the words that were set to music. So I've got a very good friend, a very old friend. Ross Edwards is his name. He's a classical composer. Classical music has been my mainstay for decades and decades, and we've collaborated together on some of his works. And in particular, back in 2002, he completed his fourth symphony, which is a setting for orchestra and two choirs of words that I wrote. So I wrote what's called the libretto, the words for it. And it's actually a musical journey through the sky. It's called Star Chant, and it starts off with the stars of the Plough, the Ursa Major, that skirt our northern horizons in the northern part of Australia, and winds up with Sigma Octantis. But it's not just the Western constellations and star names, it's the First Nations people's names as well, with many Aboriginal names scattered through it. And the ABC CD of the performance of that won this APRA award, the best choral work of 2008. So I'm very proud of that. But so I do a lot of listening, and I really enjoy listening to music. But in the 60s and 70s, I got kind of hooked up in making music, and that was not classical. That was the idea of blues and folk music, which were very much in the ascendancy in those days. And so for a while I was a professional musician. The old Gibson guitar case is behind me there. It's still there. It still goes well. But so it was a really interesting time to be doing that stuff, because there were new genres of music coming out and people doing things with guitars that nobody had ever thought you could do before. And I spent a lot of time becoming actually quite a creditable guitarist. I was a crap singer, but that was fine. It didn't seem to matter in those days.
You don't need to sing these days either, trust me.
Yeah, probably not. I ended up working with some people who then were just youngsters up and coming, but they were singing in the same clubs as I did. I was actually half of a band. And the other half is still performing in Scotland. Kenny Brill, great musician. We were called the Bradford and East Fife Ready Mix Concrete Company. That was the name of the band. But there was another band that seemed to get more gigs than we did, and they were called Humble Bums. And Scotland is where this was. In Scotland, a humble bum is actually a bumblebee. It's another word for bumblebee. But the Humble Bums, as I said, they always got more gigs, and we thought it was because they had a better name. But the two artists in the Humble Bums, one was Jerry Rafferty, who later had a huge hit with a song called Baker Street in the 1990s, an enormous hit. In my head now. Yeah, there you go. So Jerry, and he was just fabulous as a musician. He just made us all totally envious. But the other half of the Humble Bums was a fella called Billy Connolly. I've no idea what happened to him. Don't know where he went.
Oh wow!
So it was really interesting. It was a great time to be involved with all that stuff, because we were all poor, and I was a student actually, playing guitar and teaching guitar to try and make ends meet as a student. These guys were headed for stellar careers, particularly Jerry and Billy. So that's the other great love of my life, and it still is. I get enormous pleasure from both still playing the guitar, usually only in Science in the Pub these days. I did a CD a few years ago of Daft Science songs, which we did it for the International Year of Astronomy. I can't resist it, can I?
No, can't resist. It's all good.
An early like you. That was for the International Year of Astronomy. There is a real CD in there with.
Can you find this online? Can you listen to it like on iTunes?
I suspect it never, because it just missed out on the. I always thought I should have put it on the, the Music Cloud things. I'll send you a track, Mark. And,
yeah. We might be able to use it in our podcast.
Yeah, well, the best one, the one that everybody likes, which is kind of it's not the lead number on it, but because the lead number is an alien like you, as you'd expect. But the galaxy redshift blues, which is actually about the 2DF redshift survey, Stephanie. The galaxy redshift blues is the one that everybody asks for. So I'll send you that. I can email it, just the MP3.
Yes, please,
just remind me, that's all.
I will remind you, because that's way too cool.
Yeah, well, did not win an award. This didn't win an award.
Well, it should have. I love the name, the Galaxy Redshift Blues.
Yeah, it's got it all, hasn't it?
We're up to the fun part now. We're up to the spot quiz.
Right.
And being Fred with an F, I've chosen your topic. And because I know you're a light-hearted man who enjoys a good laugh, your 5 spot quiz questions will be on flatulence.
Very good.
Yep.
Very good.
Now, do you remember who our leader is, Steph? You can't remember what his...
Sarah Webb. Sarah Webb on Sea Cucumbers.
Sarah.
I think it was 4.
Oh, she got 4. So Sarah got 4.
She's incredible.
She's a
about
swot. Yeah. But she didn't have to answer questions on flatulence.
Well,
sea cucumbers.
We thought we'd go really random and go sea cucumbers, and she freaked out because she's like, I know so much about sea cucumbers. How do you know about sea cucumbers? Nobody knows about them. Sarah knows about them. So, yes, yours is flatulence. And
good.
The first question, so you've got 5 questions. What year, to the nearest, we'll go 100, was the world's oldest recorded fart joke told in?
Okay, so now by recorded, do you mean on paper or audio or...
Not on audio, pre-audio.
Pre-audio. So my guess is...
Possibly pre-paper.
Oh, no, you're pushing it back. Okay, right, so, all right, so that rules out that hypothesis. So I'm going to guess 100 AD.
You're about 2,000 years off.
All right, 2000 BC.
Has a long history. In 2008, researchers at England's University of Wolverhampton traced the ancient joke about a woman who may or may not have tooted in her husband's lap all the way back to 1900 BC. It was Sumerian, and the quip was something which has never occurred since time immortal. A young woman did not fart in her husband's lap.
Oh, I see. Okay. And we all roll about with laughter for that. Yes, of course.
I think there's some cultural context that we have.
That is the oldest recorded fart joke. So that makes it...
well, I'm delighted I've learned something tonight. Yeah.
That makes it 3,900 years old.
Question number 2. What is the medical term for a fart?
I'm so glad I chose this topic now.
I think it's something sort of suggestive like an anal eruption, or I mean we have this problem that there are many sources of farts. The sun farts in its own sweet way, and so the medical term for that is called it's called a solar flare. So maybe the medical.
I'm willing to give him a point for that, for turning it around. A good point. So for the human body, so the gas that is produced in the stomach or bowels is called flatus, Flatus.
Yeah.
My brain, because I played the flute, my brain is going flautus, but I think it's I think it comes from the same
I mean, hence flatulence as a
so it comes from the Latin word. It comes from the Latin word meaning the act of blowing. So I think that's where the flute also gets its name. The first known use of the word occurred in 1651 and is simply defined as gas generated in the stomach or bowels. Mm-hmm. And so to fart is to pass flatus.
Very, very good. I shall remember that.
So we gave him a bonus point.
Bonus mark.
So now we're on to question 3. How many times a day, on average, is an adult fart?
How many times?
Yeah, on average.
For the average adult, that's a really interesting question. And I might just sort of set my pitch here, because you might be interested to know that flatulence is not actually something that I'm afflicted with in any great way. So I'm probably an outlier statistically if I say once. But I would imagine for most people, and I'm thinking of people I know here, like my family, I would say 15.
Oh, I'm going to
Pretty
give you that
good.
because it's
Yeah.
14.
14, is it? Okay.
Yep. So
Thank you. Yay.
how much squeezing cheese is normal? Typical adults produce about 2 pints of gas a day, which sneaks or leaks out via an average of 14 farts a day. If that number seems low, don't worry. Apparently, it's perfectly normal to gas up to 21 times a day.
That doesn't surprise me. It's a very wide range.
It is a very wide range. I know some people who are up towards that 21 times a day.
Yeah.
And they're usually out doing astronomy and blame it on bullfrogs.
Yeah.
What happens if you try to hold in a fart?
You explode, of course. It's obvious. It's naturally what's going to happen.
Well, there you go. We've just solved spontaneous combustion.
Yeah.
I think that's actually people who smoke.
Oh, okay, that's right. If you smoke and you hold it in, I think it finds its way. It finds its way elsewhere and comes out of your ears or your nostrils. Or
that's pretty good. Pretty good.
Yeah.
So if you hold it for too long, the gas could be reabsorbed into your circulation system.
Yep.
And could actually leak out of your mouth. And I think, given that mouth, ears, nose all connected, I'm willing to give that one too.
Thank you.
We've gone 3 out of 4. This is to tie. This is to tie with Sarah.
Oh, look at this.
So we have Professor Fred Watson up against Dr. Sarah Webb. Do all animals fart?
There must be animals that don't. So that means the answer must be no.
And that is 4 out of 5. It's thought that octopuses don't poop, nor do soft shell clams, sea anemones, or birds. Sloths don't fart either. And they may very well be the only mammal that doesn't. The sloths might be the only... They're too lazy. That's the problem. They're too lazy, too slow. Well, there you go. We have a tied top of the leaderboard.
So I'm gonna turn it round now and ask you a question about this.
Yes.
Do you know? Okay, how can I phrase this?
Our pop quiz.
Who was the most famous professional farter?
Roland the flatulist.
I'm going to go with the guys from Blazing Saddles. Around the campfire.
But I think you're nearer, Steffi. The person I'm thinking of was very well known in the 1870s. He was a French musical actor, and he called himself Le Pétamin, the farter. And he could play scales. He could ignite things, sort of melt lead and things like that with ignited farts. He became very famous. So your point score, I think, is 1 out of 1 on that, because Steffi, I think you were pretty
9 out of 1.
So why don't you add that to mine and just gives, since you're not going to do anything else, you're not going to do anything else.
Now, are we? Is that what we're doing?
So you tell Sarah I got 5 out of 6, and that's...
Oh, here we go. We'll tell her that. She'll lodge a protest.
She's very confused.
Don't tell her what the questions were, though. She'll be
shocked.
Have
to get the FIA involved.
This is the first time that we've explored this topic on any interview that I've ever done before.
Yeah.
So you've broken new ground here. Spaghettifications.
We aim to goal to be fresh and new as much as
very good.
Yes.
Well,
now,
well done.
Fred, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on board.
It's been amazing. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure to be here, honestly. It's been a great hour and a half, whatever. I know it led it down to 3.5 minutes, but that's all right.
It's an honour to have you. You're a guest that we never really thought we would get, that's for sure. And so I seriously thank you for joining us on the podcast. It's been an honour to have you.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure. Great to see you both, and let's do it again sometime.
Thanks for listening and supporting us as we continue to learn on our podcast journey. If you would like to contribute to the podcast, you can head to www.patreon.com/spaghettification podcast and support us for as little as 1 can of beer a day. Shout out to Steve from Home Loans Easy, Jess Stout, Paul Milvain and Andy Latta for their ongoing support.